Welcome, everybody. It is 9 o'clock. We want to thank you for joining us on our day 3, our session 3 with Dr. Karina Quesada. Just as a reminder, this session will be recorded. We appreciate you joining us today. And without any further ado, I will hand it over to Dr. Quesada.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back. If this is your second or third time with me, I welcome you back. Thank you for being here. So today we're wrapping up this topic of ELL students and how we can better work with them when they are presenting with symptoms or an actual diagnosis of dyslexia. So I will go ahead and start sharing my screen with you, and my friends from Imperial County will be dropping some links for you in the chat. One of them is a direct link to the Padlet that contains all the PowerPoint slides from the last 2 sessions that we've had together and today's session. The other link that you'll find that will be shared with you is a link to a Google Drive document or folder that contains some of the resources that I'm sharing with you today in relationship to how to work instructionally with students who are presenting with dyslexia. So as the presentation moves along, I will be referencing some of those documents, and you'll have access to those at your leisure when you have an opportunity to look at those. Additionally, my friends will help me with questions. So if there is a question that's burning in your mind and you want to go ahead and ask that, I welcome that at any point. So please go ahead and do so, type it. And then I also have some time at the end of the presentation to say some final words and also to allow you to come on and speak if you need to. What else I need to say? Oh, yes, there will be a break at some point, and Lupita will give me a signal when it's time for us to take a little brain break. So I will rely on either Christina or Lupita to help me with that process. So with that, I'm going to share my screen with you, and hopefully this will work. You know, it's always exciting to know whether it will work the way you want it or not. So let's see that. Oh, actually, no, I did that wrong. So let me go back because I want to make sure that you can hear the sound as well, as we will have something that we will need to look at. So let me make sure that I have that set up from the get-go. Okay. All right. So for the benefit of those of you who may not have been in all of the previous sessions, I want to just do a quick wrap up of what we discussed in the previous presentations. Of course, that will be very quick. And if there are any questions about that, like I said, I'm welcome to do that later on. So let me move you out of the way here. Okay. So in workshop number 1, which is all the way back in September, I know it feels like an eternity, but it's not that far along, we discussed the definition of dyslexia. And if you have never heard that before, dyslexia is a phonological deficit that affects the decoding, spelling, accuracy, and fluency of children and individuals for that matter. And that in itself affects comprehension and reading experience. It becomes something that you just don't want to engage in. And as a result of that, your vocabulary and background knowledge begins to suffer, which in turn continues to affect your comprehension. So it becomes this vicious cycle. We also talked the very first time that we met that there are 3 types of dyslexia: phonological, surface, and deep dyslexia. And as evaluators, I think it is our responsibility to understand these pieces and to be fluent enough to be able to diagnose the specific type of dyslexia that the child is demonstrating, because our identification of it, of those 3 types, can really inform the practice in terms of how we're going to approach the child and how we're going to educate them. and how we're going to customize the instructions so that they can more best benefit from the instruction. And phonological dyslexia, the number one factor that you'll notice in these children is that they have problems with phonological awareness tasks. Early on, from around 3 years of age, they have an inability to rhyme. That's usually one of the first signs that we see. And this results from the poor ability of recognizing sound and symbol awareness. The other type of dyslexia that we discussed was the sort of an opposite in terms of these children actually can handle some of the decoding pieces as long as the word is phonetic, as long as the word follows the rules. However, their reading can be very labor intensive, and it takes them quite a while to read, and it gets to a point where they're unable to keep up with the pace of the curriculum. You begin to see a breakdown right around middle of first grade and second grade on. The other type of dyslexia that we discuss is the one that is very complex. Usually this also presents with language related kinds of problems, such as not understanding semantics or variations in a word, or even difficulties with reading function words that are pretty simple for the rest of us, such as the word the or so. This type of dyslexia is referred as acquired dyslexia because it results from injury to the brain. We also discussed that dyslexia presents in a continuum. We know that there are children who will not require special education services, that they will probably be successful with some accommodations and minor adjustments in the instruction. And then we also have those that are more moderate to severe range, who will need far more support and possibly either a 504 plan or even an IEP. We also discuss this, and we spend quite a bit of time assuring ourselves as professionals in an educational field that the word dyslexia, the topic of dyslexia, belongs in the school. The federal law, IDEA, recognizes the condition of dyslexia as one of those that can be captured under specific learning disability. And this has been the case ever since the 1970s, when this law for children with handicaps was adopted. So it has been in the definition of specific learning disability ever since. Additionally, California law authorizes us to discuss the topic of dyslexia in our IEPs and also in the identification of specific learning disability. Then we started talking about dyslexia in the English language. There's a complexity of the English language because English is considered a deep, complex syllabic language, meaning that it doesn't always follow the rules. So therefore, the complexity of the language is kind of obscure. So it requires very explicit and direct instruction so that children understand the rules and the logic behind the language. We also said that dyslexia presents in all languages. It is and neurological impairment. Therefore, it can be present regardless of whatever language you speak. What is different, though, is the manifestation of the condition. So for languages such as Spanish and other Romance languages that are very consistent in their spelling and sound, the representation of the language, the representation of dyslexia is a little different. It will assimilate more of the orthographic or surface dyslexia, as opposed to the phonetic piece being more impaired. We also said that we understand quite a bit of information about the profile of an EL student and how they present with dyslexia. And both monolingual and EL students present with phonological awareness and working memory deficits. So those are things that we can quickly ascertain and look for in children, regardless of their language or cultural background. We talked also about screenings. I truly believe that as school psychologists, as speech pathologists, And even at special education teachers, we all have a responsibility to educate our general education counterparts and to inform them of what we know and what we have learned. We bring expertise in the area of disabilities, and some of us will also bring expertise in the area of second language acquisition. And all of those expertise need to be combined with our general education folks so that we are catching students early on and providing them with interventions so that we can minimize the referrals for special education. But we can also assist students early on so that they are not encountering frustration with reading and giving up on the concept of school in general. So we talked about the areas that need to be assessed as part of a screening for dyslexia. And we highlighted these 3 areas that are in red as being the most critical because they have a strong correlation with dyslexia. And then in the yellow there, you'll see some of the components that I added in addition if you are working with children who are learning Spanish and are being taught in a dual immersion program. Typically, letters and letter names are not taught because of the consistency of the language. But these are all individual cases that you will need to determine based on the program that the student has been instructed with. All right. I'm going to skip this section here and allow you for some questions in just a second. Let me do a quick review first of workshop number 2 and what we covered in the month of October. So in the month of October, we talked about the pre-referral stage and our obligation to understand that children, before they are referred for special education evaluations, we need to take a quick look and a very critical look at what supports they're receiving within the general education curriculum. And we spent quite a bit of time talking about that integrated and designated ELD and ensuring that children have access to a broad and comprehensive curriculum that is not watered down simply because they are learning the language, that they still have access to the core content, but we are being mindful of their level of language acquisition and adjusting our instruction and scaffolding the instruction so that they can have access to the content. We talked about our ethical obligation of ensuring that we are providing access to research-based interventions equally. I've shared with you my experiences of some folks that I have worked with in the past who believe that EL students should not be provided with with reading instruction interventions simply because they're still learning the language. So it becomes a discussion of equity and access. And we spend quite a bit of time discussing how our EL students need to be included alongside with our general education monolingual students and receiving instruction both in ELD, English language development, as well as in reading instruction, regardless of their age. You may have high school students who are still missing those critical foundational reading skills. And simply because of their grade does not mean that we're not going to be addressing the deficit that they have. So we talked about what those multi-tier systems of support need to include. I kind of touched on that already. I think that one thing that I left out was integrating UDL, which works so hand in hand and so well with our efforts to develop English language development and to provide English language development to students, as UDL incorporates a lot of those different modalities of expression and access to curriculum. And then we talked about appropriate referrals, what constitutes an appropriate referral, and that we need to ensure that every child, regardless of their English language status, should be considered for a referral when we deem that to be appropriate based on our expertise and based on the composition of an MTSS or an SST team that understands both the disabilities components as well as the English language development components. So looking at the child from those two lenses we need to then determine, is this an appropriate referral, or are this just characteristics of a child who's acquiring a new language? So in order to be able to do that, we need to bring in the expertise, once again, of all of our professionals in the building. Of course, our ethical obligation here is that we don't want to misdiagnose the child. Adding a label to a student can be very detrimental, and it is very detrimental to the entire family. It affects the whole family dynamic. So we need to be extremely responsible about that and ensure that when we are moving in that direction, it's truly because there is a disability and not just a language difference. So informed decisions require us to consider the school environment very critically. And that also means calling out systematic issues that may not be in place for our students to support their English language acquisition or their reading acquisition. So we need to take a critical look at those components. We need to ensure that we understand their English language level, and that we are well informed in that we have done a good review of records, and that we have investigated any extrinsic factors that may exist, such as homelessness, high mobility, low attendance, trauma. All of those factors will come into play, and we need to be looking at the child as a whole in doing a comprehensive evaluation and not assuming or having a hypothesis that we're only there to prove that one hypothesis, right? And reviewing previous intervention and data is also critical for us to be including in this discussions. As you are moving along the evaluation process, we need to ensure that we understand the child's BICS, right? That interpersonal communication skills, as well as their CAP. What is their cognitive language ability, academic language ability? It is not the same as having social language conversational skills. We need to ensure that they're also building that academic language. Where are they in this process? Have we looked at the LPAC data? Have we looked at formal and informal data that will inform us about their progress in language acquisition? So that, of course, will drive your the format in which you will address the evaluation. We also discuss critical aspects, and this speaks directly to our school psychologists on the call, as well as to our speech and language pathologists who might be on the call. We need to assess those neuropsychological processes that are highly related to dyslexia. And that includes phonological, orthographic, oral language, and that means morphological awareness, rapid automatic naming, verbal working memory, as well as visual spatial working memory. You'll see there a few other things that are being mentioned, but the ones that I mentioned and are in the bold print are the ones that are highly related to dyslexia. So we want to ensure that in a comprehensive evaluation, we're including those pieces. We also talked about not being so broad, that we need to really narrow down to those skills that are more inclusive and directly related to dyslexia. So for instance, auditory skills as a whole is too broad of an area. We actually need to look more at the phonological and orthographic pieces. And then thinking about visual spatial, I am not talking necessarily about the MBPT. That is too broad of a measure. What we need to be looking for are the orthographic components. And we talked about a couple of tools that can assist us in measuring that. The visual spatial that is presented in the MBPT that we are so familiar with involves shapes, designs, pictures, objects, and location, which are not directly linked to the actual process of reading. So that's why we want to go more with the orthographic, because those components are associated with letters, words, and symbols, and tied directly to reading. All right, this is a good stopping point right now. So that was a quick and dirty review of the last 2 workshops that we've had. Any questions that may come up here before we dive into what we are going to discuss today?
There is one question in the chat.
Right.
would you please touch a little on navigating the challenges that come with assessing long-term English learners for a learning disability?
Yes. Those children present with strong oral language skills, right, that have developed very probably since birth, because many of our long-term English language learners were actually born in the United States. So they have been educated in the United States and have been hearing the language for, 5, 6 more years than that. The problem that many of those children are having is, in fact, related to the fact that they may not be able to read to a level that is appropriate in order for them to access the content and to be able to pass either the LPAC or score fluently enough, or meeting standards in the CASP assessments. So I think that these children actually require, and we will touch on this in a little bit as we continue on this morning, what these children actually require is the development of vocabulary and the development of strategies of how to approach reading. And at some point or another, someone, whoever that is at your school, will need to drill down to those reading skills that are lacking in these kiddos. And when we have this conversation, we're now discussing some systematic issues that tend to occur. Typically, by the time if we have a child that is entering middle school and definitely in high school, there is this cultural belief, I think, in our school system that we are no longer teaching reading. So that becomes very detrimental for kiddos who, for a variety of reasons, lack of appropriate instruction, it can be many factors, did not receive the foundational skills that they need in order to be able to access the content. So that is something that we're going to need to address. And I think this is a general education discussion as well as a special education discussion. So I will touch on this later on in a little more detail as we move along. But the difficulties, of course, at that point is that we have to look at in an evaluation, of course, right? You're going to find that these children are doing, relatively well in their oral skills. But I would bet money that most of them are not up to par with their reading skills. And that is what's holding them back. And remember that reading skills also affect writing. Okay, so there is a correlation. You cannot write a word that you cannot read, and you cannot read a word that you don't know. So all of that is related. So the difficulty then becomes at this point, what kind of instruction has the child received? Where are we with this? Is this truly a lack of instruction or not? And it gets into this ethical question because we are now at a point of, well, if our system within our school is broken and the only assistance that a child can get is by entering special education, that's a problem. So again, we need to be looking at systems, right? And how do we change systems? So I don't know, Lupita, that's a tough one.
Yeah, it is a tough one, but I appreciate your response, kind of going back to looking at what our general education teachers and systems within are offering to avoid creating long-term English learners. There's a follow-up question regarding same question, right? But is there a reading program that you recommend? And I want to be able to just say that it's not about a reading program more so than being able to implement diagnostic assessments that really focus on the discrete skills of literacy that may be lacking and therefore needing more intensive interventions for long-term English learners rather than a referral. So I don't know if you want to add to that, Karina, because there are intervention programs, but I think it's important to identify what discrete skills we need to address before we start, trying to implement another program that may or may not be addressing the need.
Yeah, excellent. I love your answer, Lupita, and that's exactly where I would say. I do want to add one component here. There is the clearinghouse. I can drop a link to that in a second when we take a little break. Um, there's a website, and I'm not sure if you're familiar, but it's a clearinghouse. And basically what it is you'll go in there as either as a math teacher or as a reading teacher, and you'll can type in programs for reading. But here's the trick, right? You have to be able to determine what skill within reading you're wanting to address. So the question will then become, are you looking at improving phonological awareness? Or are you looking at improving the phonics component? Where are you in that progression? Or are we talking about morphology? So the are in that continuum of instruction, you can go to this website, ask the website to do a search for you of what is a research-based program to address this discrete skill within reading. And you'll get results of programs that have been peer reviewed, that there's empirical data to support that this program is actually effective. I think that's one of the things that sometimes as educators, we get caught up with. Either someone made a choice for us, and we end up with a program in our classrooms that we're not quite sure how it addresses or how it fits with anything else that we're doing within the day. So our educators, I think, are then bombarded with a whole lot of new things. And we tend, as human beings, we tend to throw the baby with the water, right? Instead of keeping those things that are truly useful and beneficial. But data needs to be driving our decisions. And that's part of the discussion that we're going to be having today. So I want to probably get us in that direction. And I think some of those questions that are coming up will probably be answered. I hope so. That's my intent. So today's topic is the instructional needs of ELs. So what we know from research is where we're going to start off. But I cannot talk about dyslexia without actually talking about the other component that is huge that I have been addressing in the last 2 days that you have been with me. And that is the component of appreciating the language and the culture that our children bring, regardless of whether they can read in their primary language or not, regardless of how fluent they may be in their primary language. The reality is that these kiddos, these little children, are coming in already with lots of knowledge. They are coming in with background information that we as educators need to tap into and value and appreciate and pull that out of them and help them make those connections so that they can see and value, first of all, their own culture and their own language, but also understand that they are building upon that to acquire this new language that they are now being exposed to. So having an asset-oriented vision and approach is critical for me to share with you today. Also, I need to share with you that we need to be incorporating our ELD standards. And if you are an educator on the call and you haven't looked at those, I encourage you to take a look at them. This is not really reinventing the wheel. You'll notice that the ELD standards and the ELA standards match very nicely. And you'll understand if you take the time to look at them that you're not reinventing your lessons, that you're actually identifying other layers that you need to add to what you are already doing. So they are meant to be working in tandem with each other. And but I would encourage you to start there. I also would like to, for our evaluators in the room, I think as evaluators, sometimes we put on the hat of testers and we forget that our background should and is in the area of education, and that we also need to be well versed in what is ELD standards. What are they? And how do I know that when I'm coming into a classroom to observe the student, yes, I am observing the student, but I'm also there observing the instruction that the student is receiving. And is there evidence that the student is actually receiving the supports that they need? Is there evidence that the ELD standards are being incorporated? because that will help us determine if this is a disability or is this lack of appropriate instruction. So I would encourage our evaluators on the call to get acquainted with it. Take a quick look at them. That doesn't mean that you're diving into them. It doesn't mean that you're writing lessons for any of that. It just simply means that you can recognize the instruction and how that's incorporating into the curriculum that the students are receiving. The ELD standards are broken down into 3 areas. They are all meant to interact with each other. Part 1 is interacting in meaningful ways. Part 2 is actually learning how English works. So you're talking about verbs and talking about the grammar pieces, the more concrete pieces, if you will. And then part 3 is all about foundational literacy skills, which is what we have been discussing in the last 2 days and will continue to discuss today. And also the standards are divided into the level of proficiency, starting with native language and then going all the way to lifelong language learning and everything in between. So understanding this layout, I think, is critical for all of us: special ed, general ed, evaluator, instruction. So this idea of integrated and designated ELD is one critical piece. And, I'm just going to say it. It's not necessarily happening in our schools. This has been in the works for many years, but I don't necessarily see evidence of this when I go into classrooms. There may be a little bit of the integrated piece sometimes. Sometimes there is a little bit of the designated piece. Other times there isn't. So understanding the distinction between these two, I think, is a critical point as we start off about talking about interventions for dyslexia, because this other layer needs to be in place. And integrated, as I mentioned before, this is where ELs are fully included with non-ELs. So they're with their monolingual counterparts. And what is happening in this instance is that the teacher is incorporating strategies, approaches, the ELD standards, and being mindful of their EL students in the instructions so that they can have access to the curriculum. In designated time, this is a time, and the only time, when students who are learning English can be grouped based on their proficiency level and be in a prescriptive class where they are being taught specific skills based on their level. So maybe this group of children are not understanding past tense verbs, right? Maybe irregular verbs that change, like grow and grew. And having a lesson around that and doing some reading with books that depict that skill would be a way of addressing that. This is not an intervention. This is actually part of the core curriculum, and it needs to be happening for all students. So I have a little video to share with you. I don't know if you have seen this. I think it's a very powerful way of viewing how these components are incorporated. So I want us to take a minute to, it's actually about 10 minutes or so, or a little shorter, but we're going to go ahead and watch this video. Give me a thumbs up, Lupita, if you can hear the audio.
What word? What was it? Arguments. We've been using the word proposition in place of argument, as well as contention. Okay? We've been using the word contention. Now I have a word up on the board, and it says refutation. What I want you to do is, after I say refutation, I'd like you to repeat the word. So, refutation, 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 refute, 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 refute. Now, the word refute, let's go ahead and close read the definition up on the board. Okay? The action of proving a statement or theory to be wrong or false. It's important to teach explicitly the tier 2, tier 3 vocabulary words for your EL students to really ensure that they're understanding the differences in register. So they have one register when they're speaking with their friends out in the quad or the hallway, or not lunchtime and at home.
But an academic register requires a lot more. And so with that explicit instruction, you're making it very clear to them what's expected to have a scholarly conversation with someone using higher level vocabulary. Many of you are arguing right now and preparing to engage in the debate on homework, whether it should or should not be banned. Okay? For the team that is arguing that homework should be banned, the counter argument is homework should not be banned. All right? Now, when you are having that counter argument come at you in the debate, it will be very important that you know how to refute and engage in that refutation. So there's two separate ELD. There's pull-out and then there's integrated ELD. Within my classroom, an integrated ELD format would really look like explicit instruction, meticulous modeling, and then constant monitoring of students' language production in collaborative activities. Right? I have sentence stems. It says, to refute the counter argument, which is blank, I believe blank. This would refute the counter argument because. So what I would like you to do is prepare for sharing out with your groups, and I would like you to write this in your composition notebooks. So the tier 3 vocabulary word that I was teaching today was refutation. And part of the 6th through 8th writing goals for students in English language arts and ELD is to learn how to argue appropriately using reliable and relevant textual evidence. So my language objectives that I have incorporated in my lesson plans come directly out of the Common Core standards. And actually the ELD standards are woven in with the Common Core standards, so they all are related. My biggest focus with my language objectives that I have in my lesson plan is really to just get the students using purposefully the English language, whether it be written or whether it be speaking. Now, using your table placemats, number 1 should be in this section. Number 4 should be here. This is an A partner as it says in your corner. This is a B partner as it says in your corner. So I would like you to share with your A-B partners. So those are the people who are across from you. Now, I need you to also, while you are saying the word refute in your sentence stem, I would like you to make the hand signal, just so that you are practicing the sign language. And so that way, whenever you hear refute, you think about this and you're able to put 2 and 2 together. And it'll help you recall, oh no, right? Refute means to prove somebody wrong, okay? All right. At this point, I'd like partner 1 or partner A to share with partner B. Begin.
Oh, okay. So I put, to refute the counter argument, which is death penalty, is appropriate. I believe death penalty should not be appropriate because it's expensive. It's more money than having someone life in prison, right? Yeah. And then this refutes the counter argument because it shows how we are wasting money on things that are not useful. Because by killing someone, you're not changing anything. Yeah, I get you. It's both ways. I've been if someone killed someone, then there's a thing called you take a life, you lose a life. Isn't it like eye for eye?
So I use heterogeneous grouping with my students, and I do that to make sure that I have a plethora of learning abilities within each group. That you are listening and able to recall. Go.
So to refute the counter argument, which is the death penalty isn't appropriate for some cases, I believe that it won't solve anything. This would refute the counter argument because it would only bring anger to the family's victims. I don't know how to say it, but it won't solve anything. It won't bring back the victim's life. So it's just life in prison would be better.
It's important for an English language learner student to be grouped with somebody who is proficient in the language, so that way they're hearing that academic register from a fellow peer. So they're hearing my meticulous modeling throughout instruction, but to hear it also being modeled from one of their peers is really beneficial. Okay, so the first thing in your groups is you are going to be sharing out your research Using the 4 L's, so you are looking at your partner, you're leaning towards them, you're lowering your voice, and you're listening attentively. The purpose of your listening in this activity is to determine if they have facts that you do not have in your research that you need to add to your collection in your Google document. Okay, so the purpose of your listening today is to determine whether they have facts that you do not have in your Google document. Go ahead and repeat that to your groups right now.
The purpose of the listening today is for you to gather facts that you do not have in your research.
All right. Now, I also was very clear as to what's expected that you use while you are sharing your research. What is that? What are we using? What are we using while we share out? Who can tell me out loud? The sentence frames. It's very important that we're using our sentence frames to make sure that we are sharing out incomplete sentences. It's important to have sentence frames for students to get them practicing speaking in that academic register. On my desks, I have 2 sets of sentence frames. I have one for discussion, and then I have one for collaboration. So one kind of steers more towards sharing out their responses, and then the other is more coming up with a consensus as a group, and then they would use those frames to share out. It's important that they use complete sentences just for that continuous practice of speaking in the language. So the first person I'd like to share out is number 1. If you do not have somebody sitting in the number 1 spot, move into number 2. Begin.
Okay, so my research is over 150 people in the last few years have been taken off death row because they were innocent, insulted, or I don't know. And my research will be in. You just have to say the fact that you have and where you found it.
No, like you say the fact, and then you clarify on how that supports the death penalty.
This supports the death
So when we all
penalty
come back
because,
together as a class, a lot of times before I do that, I will indicate to a particular student that they're going to be called on to share out. So a lot of times you'll want a cold call just for that accountability, but it's also important to pre-select those students and give them a heads up before you call on them. The reason being is it gives them a chance to articulate and prepare themselves as far as what they want to use, especially with sentence stems and which vocabulary terms they're going to use when they're responding. But I also do it especially because I'm focusing on those English language learners. So most of the time I will have my English language learner be the pre-selected student to share out because I really want them to not only practice that academic register within their small groups, but also out loud. As a group, you decide which one that you guys have is the strongest fact to support your argument, okay? And I would like Michelle to share out.
So you get to pick someone's. It could be your own when he's done, and then you just share it out.
Okay, Michelle's group, can you please share out your findings as a group?
Yeah, one piece of evidence that we got from a YouTube video, it was saying the pros and cons of death penalty, and I strongly agreed that death penalty is brutal and uncivilized. I believe this because it shows that death penalty is not right because you're doing the same crime by killing someone that killed someone else.
So in other words, what you're saying is that murdering somebody who committed a murder is not the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, what if you're saying, what would your group say in response to the counterclaim that, well, we need to get rid of the people who are causing these crimes and causing harm and a danger for our community? How would you respond to that? How would you refute that?
I would refute that by saying most people believe that
It's important that once
having
your
the death
pre-selected
penalty
student
would be the right
shares
thing
out
to do,
their
showing
prepared
that you
response,
killed someone
it's
else.
important to not just stop there and move on with instruction. You want to intentionally ask them why. Expand that rigor and encourage them to think on the spot. So that way they really are getting more practice with that language. They're critically thinking to come up with on the spot their response to your question, which will be more rigorous. The ELA and ELD framework is meant to work together. It's not meant to be two separate entities. And with that in mind, and just being intentional about these little tiny strategies that you can incorporate every day in your classroom is really going to be highly beneficial for your English language learners. And having that constant practice of that language will increase their proficiency tenfold.
So technically, okay, so the fact is the death penalty adds cost to the government and taxpayers, right? Okay, and the counter argument would be that the death penalty costs the government less as opposed to life imprisonment without peril.
Well, what I put for my counter argument was like,
All right. So with that, if I could just kind of ask your thoughts on this, and you can drop that in the chat as a reflection of what did you notice? What are some good strategies that you can pull from this video? And let me share with you that the purpose why I present this video in this topic of dyslexia is because it really highlights what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about EL students. You'll see in action what we're referring to. So I'd like to hear what you thought, what you saw, what you observed as good teaching practices, as something that perhaps you had not considered before in the chat. And we'll give a couple of seconds for you to do that if you don't mind. What is the takeaway for you from this video?
While folks are priming the pump and thinking about what they just viewed, I just want to chime in and say that how intentional and deliberate the teacher is in designing and delivering integrated ELD, and the range of scaffolds that are provided from beginning to end. It's very clear and evident that the students are familiar and used to engaging and using these scaffolds.
Perfect. Thank you, Lupita. Another factor that I think I failed to mention before I play the video, and I don't think I did, so remind me if I did. This classroom is actually a high school, as you can figure. It's a high school class of mild, moderate students. Could you tell that this was a mild, moderate class?
Not at all.
Not at all.
The comments are coming in. I love how the teacher listened to her students and acknowledged their responses in a non-judgmental way. The importance of explicit instruction. Appreciated the explicit and intentional instruction and use of sentence frames so seamlessly.
Yeah, thank you for that. So this is a mild, moderate class. You wouldn't know that. You wouldn't know that this is a mild, moderate because the curriculum has rigor. It's not watered down. The scaffolds are there to support children, whether EL, and of course, these strategies will support other students that simply have disabilities, and they may not necessarily be adding in addition of the language component. But yes, to all of those comments that you added, it's not judgmental. It's a safe place to practice language. I think one more thing that I want to highlight to you, if you did not, and maybe you did, but did not share out, there is a very intentional way in which peers are utilized. There's a recent research, and the name is not coming right now to me, so I'm not going to spend time on that, but there is a research that was recently discussed that indicates that students who are learning English only spend 6 minutes a day in interacting with others in language, peer language supports. Out of the 330 minutes or so of instruction in a day, only 6 minutes are allocated in most classrooms for peer-to-peer interaction, when in reality, the research supports that that is a critical manner in which children play with the language. They hear the models, and they acquire and expand their own learning from that. So that I think is something that is highly noticeable in the video that we just watched. And I loved how the teacher was very intentional about that as well, where she had a child who had higher language ability with another one who did not. And they could hear those models from each other and learn from each other. So just wanted to add that other component there.
There's one more comment in the chat.
Yes.
Starting with the message that students' social registers are valued and important, so students know they are capable language learners and language users. Absolutely.
Yeah, great. Perfect. Thank you for that. All right. So this is another quick slide to just capture this idea and hopefully bring it home for you. And there is also intention in me sharing this video. I understand and have trained quite a few of my colleagues, my dear school psychologists, who may have not had an opportunity to be in the classrooms themselves. Some of us went straight to, from high school, college, and became school psychologists. You may not have a strong suit in the area of instruction. And I think watching these videos and learning what good teaching looks like is crucial for us, so that when we are in a classroom doing observations and judging whether this is a disability or not, we have a better idea what good instruction should look like. So I bring this very purposefully for my peers who have had the opportunity to be in a classroom. So ELD is not a remediation or intervention. This is separate. Okay, an intervention for reading is separate than what we just watched. It's not an extra dose of content instruction, because that will mean that you're neglecting the content. It's not just merely sentence frames, although that is highly used in this video, but it's not just that. It's the incorporation of the ELD standards and all the other layers that were incorporated. It's not optional. It's actually required by law. And it's not simply just SODI instructions. What it is, though, it is an opportunity for students to develop the language. Is dependent upon the ELD standards and the proficiency of the student, and is required for every child, even if you only have one in your class. So what do we know then? We know that EL students learn best in an educational context that is rich in language, that is varied. And we saw a model of that. We saw how rich the teacher's language was, and how in her choice of words was very intentional as well. It has multiple forms of literacy. As you saw in the video, she was probably using an argumentative types of literacy, right? And arguments in instruction with her students, and with various types of organizational structures. We also know that children learn best when there is cooperative, dyad, and individual pieces. Excellently demonstrated in this video that we just watched. And there are multiple forms of instructional strategies. There's interactive, Socratic, and lecture type, right? And we saw a little bit of that in the video that we watched for that short period of time. So additionally, we know that children who are learning English require explicit teaching of the linguistic elements. They need to understand how vocabulary works. They need to understand the syntax, the word order. They also need to understand grammar, functions, and conventions. These are not casual things that they just are going to stumble upon. They actually need very specific examples of that, and that it is explicit. They need to integrate meaning and communication in their teaching and of language. And they need to include interactive activities among students that are carefully planned. And that's what you saw in this video. Now, with those children who also have disabilities, We know that those children learn best when we're building upon the knowledge that they bring. So you're tapping into their home language, asking them, how do you say this in your language? How would you describe this, right? And valuing that language and that knowledge and that culture that they're bringing in. It should be in a natural way and meaningful. There's context to it. We're not learning words in isolation, but rather our selection is very carefully monitored and selected. And it needs to be explicit as well. And there's that academic language along with the conversational language. And you saw a demonstration in this video of how the teacher was incorporating that higher academic language that is what's going to provide us access to abilities later on. Here's the other piece, peer-assisted learning. We know that this is very effective for students with disabilities. A stronger English speaker models the language for the other students, more time on task with small groups, and it's also less intimidating for ELs that are just emerging, right? They need a safer, more intimate way of trying out the language before being able to speak in a larger group. I also wanted to share these other supports that you may consider with ELs who have disabilities. This is in your PowerPoint handout. I'm not going to necessarily read all of this to us. You can do that on your own, but it gives you the linguistic support, how that could look in the classroom, as well as other kinesthetic kinds of supports that you may incorporate. All right, for my lower students, lower meaning in the lower grades, although this is a second grade classroom, even if you're teaching in middle school or high school, I would encourage you to watch this video with me with an open mind of how could you bring all of these components and adjust it into a setting that is more age appropriate and socially appropriate, right? The chance that you're going to be hearing and listening to this teacher, could we incorporate some of that singing, that kinesthetic and that singing modality into a rap, into something that is more appropriate for a child who is in the older grades. So from that lens, if you could indulge me again, and we're gonna watch this other video of integrated and designated ELD. And I think after this, we'll probably take a quick little break. And I think there's great value in this as well. So here we go.
We'll tell you a story of how this cotton becomes the jeans that we are wearing.
We're in a second grade classroom and they're doing a unit on supply and demand and goods and services.
So we'll use the language of sequence.
Today's lesson was really zooming in on some content that they'd covered through a drawn label about how cotton becomes jeans and the different steps it goes through to become jeans.
So we're going to be practicing using kind of language. Sequencing language, that's right.
This lesson is focused on the language function of sequence to tell how something goes from the initial natural resource into the product.
So we're going to start out telling the story of cotton to jeans in the present, and then we'll move it into the past.
Today, she began by pulling a group for designated ELD. She has all 3 levels of English language learners in her class, emerging, expanding, and bridging students, and she began by pulling all of her English language learners to the carpet.
So we're going to take that story of cotton plant to jeans, and we're going to tell it using all that rich sequencing language. But we're going to need a really important part of speech to help us do that. What part of speech are we going to need to tell about all the action that happens? We're going to need our... No, you said it. You said it. We're going to need our verbs to tell that story. And I was wondering if I could have you read with me some of the verbs that we are going to use to tell the story that we think we'll need. Grow. Oh, I hear Ariana. Grow. Load. Transport. Weave. Make. Cut. Beautiful. Assemble. Manufacture.
During designated ELD, we're doing two things. We're thinking about how to prepare for the lesson. And so here you saw her front loading some of the language and really giving students a chance to orally practice what they were later going to be doing independently or with the whole group. So she was preparing them for that.
Following this, who did what?
The factory.
The factory workers. What did they do? What did they do in the past? Did they make it? They
Made.
I just heard it. They made the denim fabric. Beautiful.
The other part of designated ELD is in response to. So you saw some of the work she'd been doing is really listening to her students and then identifying, oh, this group of kiddos is really struggling with verbs in the past tense. And so she's done some really intentional work around verbs and really responding to what she saw and heard.
The next step in the process is manufacturing.
With that group of students, she then had a chance to review a chant that they had learned whole class, but this time really zooming in on that language of sequence.
From there she loads it and transports it.
And it was a chant that not only embedded the content that she's working on in this unit of supply and demand and goods and services, but also embedded the language of sequencing.
We're going to hunt in our chant for some excellent sequencing language. And I want you to touch your brain. And with your other hand, I want you to put a finger up for every bit of sequencing language that you see.
And so students highlighted and had a chance to do a think, pair, share and talk with their partner about what were the sequential words or phrases in that chant.
Initially, from there, the next step in the process.
Giving students an opportunity to share their idea with another person before being asked to share in a group really allows for everyone to have a chance to speak. It's an oral rehearsal.
I think finally the consumers buy the jeans and purchase the jeans.
When we pull small groups for designated ELD, we have an opportunity to provide a safe environment. Students feel more comfortable taking risks. They're in a small, safe group of other English language learners.
Beautiful. So if we're going to talk about the process of cotton plants to jeans, I'll take a quiet hand. Where are we going to start? Ariana.
Initially, the farmer grows the cotton with natural resources like water, sun, and soil.
Then with that group, she used the drawn label that they had previously learned whole class and then revisited whole class. This time what they were doing is pulling the information off the drawn label onto a graphic organizer.
What was some of that language we could use to tell about what happens next? What happens in the middle? Oh, the next step in the process, following this. Actually, let's see, Justin.
The next step in the process.
Great, go for it. The next step in the process.
The next step in the process is when the denim factory takes the cotton and wovens it into fabric.
Wonderful.
She went over the different types of sentence frames, really providing students with opportunities about where they choose to enter into the language.
Following this, the farmer transports it to the factory.
She's got these 3 different levels of English language learners in her classroom. And in looking at the ELD standards for 2nd grade, those different levels require different levels of scaffolding.
You are going to take our sequencing graphic organizer. You are going to sketch the process of cotton planted jeans. And you are going to tell the story to your partner. You're going to practice telling the story.
She excused the bridging students to go off and work with a partner using a graphic organizer to recreate the steps from cotton to jeans and then orally practice that with a partner.
Initially, the farmer grows the cotton and then he transports the cotton to the manufacturers. The manufacturer workers make denim fabric, cut and sew and assemble them. They sell them in stores or online, and then the consumers, at the end, the consumers buy the jeans.
She kept with her emerging and expanding students that still needed a little more of the scaffold in the form of teacher support.
I want us now to practice telling the story of this exact pair of jeans. Christian, it didn't get made today, it got made some time ago. So we're going to need to use verbs that tell about things that happen in the past.
When she was with just the emerging and expanding students, she began to really dive into that idea of past tense verbs and really supporting and scaffolding those students to use past tense verbs to talk about how those genes came into being.
So while the farmers grow the cotton, what if it happened the other day or last year?
They grew.
The farmers
Grew.
grew the cotton. Will you say that with me? The farmers grew the cotton.
They had the sentence frames there right next to them to refer to. They had the realia of the drawn label and the real images. And then they also had the support of their friends as they did those think, pair, shares to tell this story in the past tense of how these genes came into being.
Supply and demand rule the marketplace.
In integrated ELD, she began with 2 chants, giving students a chance to get their wiggles out, to have blood moving through their body. And these were both chants that embedded that high level of academic vocabulary as well as the content of the unit.
A step in the process is manufacturing.
One of them was also focused.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop us there. The rest of the video demonstrates the integrated ELD. You'll notice that she brought in her monolingual students, and now she has a full classroom of all children present, your ELs and your monolinguals. We have all been learning the same content, but now we are all coming together, and she continues to incorporate those scaffolds for her ELs. But that designated time was utilized to allow them access to the curriculum at their level of proficiency. So I selected these 2 videos very intentionally to demonstrate to you what an ELD integrated and designated could look like, and also to demonstrate to you what it could sound and look like in a high school setting or, middle school, high school, as well as in an elementary level. Both teachers, you just want to clone them, right? I mean, they're beautiful, they're skillful in what they do. And I think that regardless of the age level that you work with, by watching either one of those videos, you could walk away with some ideas and a visual of what we have been trying to convey, or what I have been trying to convey to you in the last, days that we have been together, in really emphasizing that this is that foundational skill that we need, that layer of support that all children need before we talk about a disability. Before we talk about reading, this is the other layer that we need to discuss. And I would be very, it would be very naive for me to just sit here and talk with you about reading interventions if we're not addressing this other piece. Our EL students need to have this piece along with some reading instruction. So when we come back from our quick break, we're going to then begin to discuss what could that reading instruction look like, and how do we start, and we start with data. So let me give you that one component here. So Lupita, I think what time is it? It's 10:10. What do you think? What time do we come back?
I think 10 minutes is good.
All right, sounds good. So we'll see you back at 10:20 then. Go and refresh your coffee, and we'll see you in a little bit, okay? All right, hello everyone. Welcome back. I hope you get an opportunity to refresh your coffee and answer emails probably. All right. So let's see. I'm hoping that I can't see most of you, but I'm hoping that we're all back and ready to roll. So we're gonna continue on and discuss some specific and critical instructional components that are needed for children who present with dyslexia. And what we know from the research of at least the last 45 years has continued to demonstrate that these are the layers that are needed in order to support students who are presenting with reading difficulties. And also know that these strategies, which similar to the ELD lessons that we had the opportunity to watch from those videos, similar to that, that type of quality of instruction is beneficial for all students. Similarly, the strategies that we're going to be discussing for dyslexic readers are also beneficial for all students. So you are not necessarily creating lessons geared toward, a set of students. These strategies have been proven to be beneficial for all students, for all readers. So as we talk about that, I'm going to have us revisit some of the conversations that we've had in the past, which are the simple view of reading. I touched on this on the first day that you were with me. And the simple view of reading is the work of Guff and Tungmer, dating back to 1986, where they came up with this equation that reading comprehension is the result and the product of language comprehension and decoding, or word recognition. And I highlighted to you back then, if you were with me on day one, that it is a product, because when one of these is missing, the result will always be 0. Okay, so 1 times 0 will always be 0. We will not have reading comprehension if language comprehension is missing, or if decoding word recognition is missing. So understanding this, what we need to then break down is the components of the instruction, the what. What is it that is captured in the decoding piece, and what is captured in the language comprehension piece? When you understand these pieces, you begin to tailor your instruction and choose your curriculum and choose your programs in order to address these components. That is the hesitation and the reason why I will not recommend a program, because this is not something that you can go and purchase and have it packaged for you. What we need to understand is what integral pieces are needed so that I can look at what I have in my classroom and then be able to identify, okay, this addresses phonology, this addresses orthography, this addresses morphology, and this is how I'm going to be incorporating it and creating a lesson. The same goes with language comprehension. We're teaching the semantics, the syntax, the pragmatics, and the discourse. I understand fully that in these 3 trainings that we've had together, there is not an opportunity, not sufficient time for me to break down all of those pieces and actually demonstrate how you would do that. That would be something that's your homework. That's for you to go then and research, okay, where do I gain that knowledge? Where can I gain those trainings? I will be sharing with you some handouts to get you started with those components, right? Those have been, I put them all together in a Google folder for you to go and access that. Those are starting points that can hopefully get you in that direction. So as we go there, the how, so that was the what, this is the how you're going to do it. We also know, and this is actually an ed code, and I mentioned that on day 1, that ed code indicates that children require explicit, systematic, cumulative, diagnostic, and responsive teaching. So explicit means that there's no guessing about it, that we are being very intentional in describing the rules of the game. That there's no ambiguity in this. So we're going to teach this one component So for instance, today we're talking about the C and then the H together, and that when they come together, they make a digraph and they make one sound, and CH together say ch. Okay, so that's explicit. You're teaching that concept. It's systematic, meaning that there's purpose in it. We're going and there's an objective to it. It's cumulative, meaning that you're building upon those skills. So that assumes that there's a scope and a sequence in which things are taught. That is one of the things that you will find in the handouts that I provided for you. There is a scope and sequence of how we approach this whole concept of teaching reading, starting off with specific consonants. We don't just randomly teach letters, starting with the letter A and going in order. There's actually a sequence that is suggested that has been proven to be effective. And if you take a look at that scope and sequence that I share with you, you'll notice that there are specific letters that are suggested to be introduced first, because they are actually incorporating the name of their letters within the sound. So for instance, the letter M has also in its name has the sound incorporated in it. So that provides consistency for children. So is the letter F. The letter F in its name has also the sound that it makes, the F sound. So those are things that you may or may not have known in your teaching program, may not have been taught to you. And then there's a sequence in which we teach vowels. And then we start off with short vowels. We start off with, then followed by long vowels. And then we begin to teach diphthongs. Those are, those two vowels that come together and make one sound, or they make a combined sound. So there's a scope and a sequence in which we do this, and that's the cumulative piece. So you're building upon each skill. Diagnostic, meaning that you're not just following a curriculum just because. You are instructing in such a manner that you are noticing whether students are responding and whether that you need to go back and reteach something. So that's the diagnostic piece, that you're incorporating that, so it's responsive. In the diagnostic is along the way, right? Maybe children already have consonants and vowels solid, but maybe they don't have long vowels. So that would be your starting point. That's your entry point into this. Or maybe they have passed that already and now they're more advanced and maybe they're needing digraphs, right? So digraphs are those letters that come together and they make one sound. Or maybe they are past that and now you're looking at blends, okay? So those are two letters that come together and make two sounds, together quickly, right? So the letter blend is one of those, right? It has the BL together and they come in pairs, bull, and they make that sound. So knowing those things, then you will know where your entry point is in all of that. Or perhaps you're dealing with children who are a little bit past that, and now you're at the point of morphology, where you're teaching prefixes and suffixes and root words, and that understanding of how those things are incorporated, what they mean, and that will open up the door for other layers to this. So in all of that, you're engaging in this diagnostic formative assessments, and you are being responsive as well. So you readjusting your instruction to allow children to enter and to continue to make progress. So this is the how of how it's done. Okay. And then not neglecting the oral language component. You are building vocabulary as you go. And this is critical for all students, but more so for our low SES students. They may be monolingual, are coming with low SES, and therefore their vocabulary may not be as rich. But it's also very intentional for our EL students who are already in need of vocabulary development. So incorporating all of that is not something that it's optional. We need to be very intentional about it. The reality is that we cannot understand a word that we don't know. Okay, you might be able to decode a word, but if you don't know what it means, we're still at a 0, right? Because comprehension, reading comprehension requires that we know language. Okay. So to break this even a little bit more, we talked about the reading rope a few days ago when we were together. And this breaks down those skills even a little bit further. So the language comprehension piece, starting with background knowledge, those are just facts, concepts that we're building and being very intentional about. Vocabulary, we're talking about the breadth and the depth of vocabulary, the precision, right, and linking other things with each other so that we're building more and more as we go. An example of that, right? We start off with the word cat, simple word, but from there we build more and more knowledge and understanding that cats are part of a feline and that they're mammals and that they're furred and warm-blooded, right? And you begin to develop more and more knowledge about that. And then you are now far more sophisticated. You went from a cat to discussing mammals, right? So all of that is part of that vocabulary that we need to continue to build in our kiddos. And then language structures, understanding syntax, understanding word order and how we organize language, and comparing as well the differences between Spanish and English, right? If that's a language that you're familiar with, and how we organize descriptor words, nouns and adjectives, and the order changes in English, and the semantics, the meaning of words, the play of words, right? And we can get all sophisticated with that when we're talking about idioms, and then expressing that to our children who are learning English and being very explicit about that. Verbal reasoning, inferences, and metaphors. Those kinds of skills are the ones that are going to allow children to have access to that academic register that we have seen in that video demonstrated. And then literacy knowledge, starting with our babies who are just learning print concepts. They're learning that letters carry a message, that what we are actually reading is on the page. It's not being made up. The letters carry a message. And then moving on to the higher genres, right? Poetry and expository kinds of writings and argumentative kinds of writings. So all of those layers are integrated, are woven into what becomes a skill reader. And then for the part of word recognition, starting with phonological awareness. One of the first layers of that is understanding syllables. Understanding that the word rainbow has 2 syllables, rainbow. And you see our kindergarten teachers and our first grade teachers clapping those, right? Rainbow. If you take away rain, what do you have? You have bow, right? And that play of language. Understanding rhymes, and producing rhymes. But then it gets more and more sophisticated. The word cat, and take away k and add a what do you have, right? And now you have rat. Or take away the what do you have left? At. And understanding those concepts is the foundational skills of reading. Many children who have dyslexia are lacking these skills. And it doesn't matter if you're in first grade or in high school, that continues to be the layer that is missing for children. And it's a skill that can be taught. How you're going to approach that, well, that's your skill as an educator. Clearly, children who are in high school will not respond to baby rhymes, right, and to chanting, but they will respond to other ways of teaching that skill. So this is where your expertise and your art, right, because teaching is an art. This is where the art of teaching comes in you being able to reach that child and understanding the emotional component that comes with it, because these children have encountered years of failure. So now you're dealing with that as well and being very intentional in that component. The decoding piece, starting with the alphabetic principle and then moving on to all of those until you get to, morphemes. And now we're talking about Greek and Latin roots, right? So we're building upon those skills. Where is your entry point of this? That will be determined by the assessments that you do to initially diagnose where the child is in the area of reading and where are the gaps. Where are you coming in and filling those gaps? Sight recognition. These are words, and I want you to think of this not as sight words. I know sight words are used as words that are irregular and we just teach those by memory. What I'm actually addressing here by sight recognition is that that accumulation of words that are now owned by you, where you no longer need to decode them. Regardless of whether they're phonetic or not, they're part of you and you can quickly access them. Okay, that's what we know as sight recognition in structured literacy in the science of reading. So sight recognition are those words that we have had exposure to many times and now they become part of us. So I no longer need to stop and decode those words. They're part of my long-term and short-term memory. For children with dyslexia, we know that for a typical reader, an average reader, we require 1 to 4 exposures to a word in order for that to be committed to memory. For a child with dyslexia, they require at least 10 or more. So depending on where you are in the continuum of severity of the condition, you may require many more exposures than 10. So understanding that you need to continuously revisit and continually tap into memory components will allow the child to commit this to memory. And this is, once again, where the art of teaching comes in, right? Because it's not just about a drill and kill kind of approach. It is about also incorporating all modalities. So here's where your good teaching comes in. And this is also where our evaluators, our school psychologists, need to be very mindful in the recommendations of incorporating multisensory types of activities so that the child can have access to their memory. Children with dyslexia, many of them will present with memory difficulties. So knowing that, in our instruction, we need to be mindful of incorporating multisensory. So using, silly things, chants, using whatever clue you need to remember a word. There may be particular things that you can point out about a word in order to commit that to memory. Also, the use of our not only auditory but kinesthetic movement can assist with that. Having children draw with bumps on their paper so that they can feel the letters. Also, shaving cream, it's another thing that the little guys use. Sand is another thing that they use because they can then feel the words as they are spelling them, as they are committing them to memory. So these are strategies that we need to be incorporating in our reports for recommendations, but also in our instruction. If we know that children with dyslexia already are coming in with a disadvantage in the area of memory. So we need to layer those supports for them. Here is the work of Dr. Beck in terms of vocabulary instruction. It is not sufficient to just go and select random words, right? We need to be very intentional about the words that we're selecting, just like we watched on the video. The lesson, it had sophisticated words, tier 2 words that give access to other across context. So we want to spend our money on tier 2 kinds of words. These are words such as hilarious, endure, despise, arrange, compare, contrast. subsequently, right? We heard some of those words in the videos that we watched. And then for our high school and middle school children who are now facing much specific kinds of language that are found in the sciences, social and earth sciences and sciences, we want to be intentional about selecting those words that they're going to be encountering. Atom, molecule, metaformic, sedimentary, continent. Those are words that will provide them access to the content, to the domain that they're studying. So those are the places where we want to live and be very selective in our choices of how we're teaching this vocabulary to our students. And again, these are good strategies for dyslexic and non, for ELs and non, right? So these are just good teaching practices. In terms of how you approach that, you want to teach the pronunciation of the word, give a little bit of meaning of why the word exists. What are the roots of that? Don't water down the curriculum. Don't water down the knowledge. Children are curious, and we can inform them of the roots of the word as well. So there's a difference between explaining and defining a word. So you want to highlight those points of interest for them. Provide real life examples. We saw the video of that teacher and how she incorporated real objects into her teaching, bringing jeans, bringing pieces of cotton, fabric, and all of those components whenever possible, whenever it's available to you, will only expand on the knowledge of children and deepen their understanding and provide them with those authentic activities that will provide them the opportunity to commit this to memory. There's something tangible that you can attach to, and that is so beneficial for children that have memory issues and language issues as well. The teaching of comprehension. These are some of the strategies that I encourage you to consider. The use of questioning, expand on that. Don't just accept a yes or no type of answer, but continue to expand the language. Continue for them to try little ways of explaining things. Making predictions. The use of summarizing. Providing some writing opportunities for them to extend upon the reading that they did. Having them write for a purpose, such as pen pals. When there is purpose in what we're writing, that can also expand our comprehension. And then personal reactions to text. Those are all strategies that have been proven to be beneficial for English learners. Also, I encourage you to highlight the cross-linguistic relationships with language. Even if children have not received instruction in their primary language, that doesn't mean that they don't bring knowledge, oral knowledge. So you want to highlight those. For instance, in Spanish, many consonant sounds are similar to English. So you want to point those things out to them. And then point out to them how similar the short vowels are in Spanish, in English, to the vowel sounds in Spanish. So those are points of entry, once again, right? Remember that memory is built upon the concept of something else that I already know. That's how we build knowledge. That's how we build memory. If I can associate it to something else that I already have knowledge about, it is easier for me. That's a point of entry. And that makes things a little easier for us. And then once you're there, right, then you want to start highlighting the differences. Clearly, vowels in English are complicated, right? So you want to highlight those things and assimilate them to other things that may be common with the home language. In terms of linguistic modifications, we want to provide concrete and visual representations of those new concepts, similar to what we saw. I also encourage you to limit the length of the linguistic structure. So, don't get carried away with it. Yes, you want the rigor to be there, but you also want to be very mindful of how much is being provided. Front load, vocabulary. We saw that in the video, the second video that we watched. Having the children who are learning English provide them with that language so that they can play with it and experience that and have an ability to hear it from their peers, from their teacher. That provides them that opportunity to be front loaded with it. Very beneficial as well for children who also have dyslexia. Use controlled vocabulary when given directions. If you notice in the video, the first video that we watched, the teacher had a specific language that is used when we are interacting with peers. Okay, so that is something that you want to consistently set it up and continuously use that so that children know exactly what to expect. Avoiding the passive voice is one thing that, even in our writing, right, as college students, we learn this. Less is more, get to the point right away. That is very beneficial for linguistic modifications, but also for dyslexic kiddos who get lost in the details, right? And remember that on the first day, we learned that many of our dyslexic kiddos also have attention issues. So eliminating the excess is always beneficial for them. That doesn't mean water down the curriculum. It means be very strategic and purposeful in the language that you're using. Avoid sarcasm and avoid idioms in your daily conversation. That is not beneficial. It's threatening for a student who's learning English. And it's also threatening for a student who has a disability. They already bring a lot of self-consciousness into this aspect. We don't need to add anxiety, more anxiety to this relationship that we're building with them and that we have with them. So eliminate that. Idioms, though, can be very beneficial when we're talking about semantics, right? And the meaning of words. That's different. We want to use that as, we're modeling language, such as the use of, it's raining cats. That would be an idiom, but don't use that in your daily interaction with students. And then use short noun phrases, avoid subordinate clauses, and use alternate forms of presentations. And we saw that, a good model of that, visuals, models, charts, and the sort, right? We got to experience that. So this is a recap, if you will, of what we watched in the video, because this is good teaching practices. So SAI in reading, let's talk about that. If bilingual programs are available, I've had gotten these calls from some of our schools that I work with. What language do we deliver SAI in when we have a dual language or a bilingual program? What I have gathered from the research is that it is best practice to match the SAI reading intervention to the language of instruction. I'll let that set in for a couple of seconds because that creates some problems for some of our schools where they may not have a bilingual staff member who is in special education and holds a special education credential. So I understand the complexity of what I'm sharing, but I also understand what the research says. So I'm delivering this message. I know that this can create a little bit of problems, but it is counterproductive to be providing reading instruction in one language when the rest of the day is in another language. And if I may add a personal experience, I was asked to do an independent evaluation for a district in the greater LA area for a family that was contesting this very point. The child was in a dual language program, 80% Spanish, 20% English. And the school did not have a bilingual SAI teacher. So that created problems and confusion, and parents were just not satisfied with that. So they, started a due process case. And of course, in that process, everything else came under the microscope, right? So I came in to consult with them and to do an evaluation. And I can't deny what the research says. And this is, something that I know creates problems in terms of staffing. But those are things that you're going to need to consider. Other things of consideration would be the age of the grade of the child and the percentage of English being taught, right, in the classroom. So if your model in the age of the student maybe is the flip side of that, right, where you're maybe doing 20% Spanish, 80% English, then, those are things of consideration that you will need to have a discussion with. Ideally, right, with both departments. You want to include your ELD department as well as your special education department in that, and then really determine how is it best to service the student. And that's what the next slide, the next bullet says. So you want to seek bilingual staff and train in evidence-based Spanish programs. I know Esperanza is one of them. Please research what is appropriate for you. All right. Well, then let's talk about what SAI could look like then in a program, right? And I think many of our districts encountered this. So ELD level, so you want to make sure that you're considering that and how this may impact literacy development. Those things go hand in hand. Remember, you cannot really decode a word and make meaning of a word if you don't know that word, right? So this is where our ELD component is so important, and why I spend the first hour of our day today discussing that piece. Because you can teach children how to decode, but if it does not part of that vocabulary word is not part of them, it would have no meaning whatsoever. So those things need to go hand in hand. Primary language, build upon students' knowledge in the primary language, tap into that. Remember, this is not just for those kiddos that have been instructed formally in their home language. This is for all children, because they still bring in knowledge. They're still bringing in culture. They are still bringing in understanding of the world. So we don't want to dismiss that. You're grouping, group students strategically based on their reading-like disabilities, and then incorporate ELD strategies in conjunction with your SAI. Right? So that's a component that we need to discuss. And it's also one of those things that sometimes we neglect to discuss in our IEPs. Unfortunately, I see this over and over again, right? The moment a child becomes identified as a child with a disability, the EL label goes out the window, and we neglect that piece, and we don't discuss it. We don't know who's doing it. We think somebody is, but we're not sure who that is. And there is no collaboration between the professionals of how we're approaching this, and what language are we using, and what level is the student? Are they making progress or not? So we need to continue to work together with our gen ed folks, our ELD folks, and continue to design lessons that are appropriate for them. So strategies to support ELs with disabilities, right? Leverage the background knowledge, play that in, tap into that. That's cash coming in. Don't let that cash go to waste. Scaffold comprehension of complex text, foster that vocabulary development, scaffold the writing, scaffold the language. You want to build collaborative discussions. Doesn't matter, mild, moderate, children can participate in that. We saw that well displayed in that video. And then you want to sequence the learning tasks, break those down for us. Primary language support. This is different than primary language instruction. Okay, do not confuse those. Primary language support can be provided to all children. Primary language instruction, that's a different thing. Okay, that means that you're in a bilingual program, in a dual language program of some sort. But primary language support can be provided to all children. This is not the language of instruction, but it is an option that is always available for all students, and use at any time during any kind of teaching. Right? How and what could that look like? Here are some examples for you. Instructions in the primary language, if that's available to you. Maybe with a peer, a tutor of some sort. So how is that available to you? Providing written translations for a learning task whenever appropriate, right? Drawing students' attention to cognates. We discussed that, I believe, on day one, how we can highlight those words that are very similar. And of course, I'm going to use, a Spanish word because that's what I know. But cooperation and cooperación, the spelling is very similar. The pronunciation is very similar. And if I can tap into that prior knowledge, I'm already ahead of the game. Inviting students to speak or write in their first language as appropriate. Continue to foster that whenever appropriate. Of course, if the purpose is to demonstrate their reading and writing ability, that's not the time to do that. But if the purpose is to understand how volcanoes work and how an eruption happens, I would accept that in another language. You have to understand what the purpose of the lesson is and know when to accept a language and demonstrations of knowledge in another language, right? So if the purpose is to develop a short paragraph in English, then that would not be an appropriate thing to do. Okay, so know when to and when not to use those things. All right, here's a good stopping point for questions. Do we have any, Lupita?
Yes, we have one. What is the best practice discerning the teacher to student ratio in specialized academic instruction? High school level, SDC, and RSP.
Yeah. So if I had a magic wand, right, and I could have the world the way I want it, I would say that we know from research that those reading interventions that are more effective are where low student to teacher ratio occurs. And I believe that that is between 5 and 7 per adult. Is that feasible for every district? No. And I want to make a distinction between caseload and intervention groups, because I think we're talking about two different things, right?
Right.
And if I'm not mistaken, and Lupita and Christina, feel free to jump in if you have more precise information. But I believe in Ed Code, RSB teachers do have a specific number that is given. But I don't believe that that's the case for SDC teachers. I also want to say that here is another area where we need to tread very carefully, because unions come into play, right? There are contractual agreements between our teacher unions and districts, and we need to be very mindful of that. So I certainly don't want to step into an arena that can be muddy and that I'm not necessarily well versed in, and that it may be very unique to your own district. So, but I do know what the research says in terms of interventions. Interventions are far more effective when they are consistent, explicit, and when they are applied with fidelity, and when the student to teacher ratio is controlled. And I do know that 5 to 7 per adult is what is appropriate. Any other ones?
Nothing in the chat at this point.
All right, perfect. Then we'll continue.
One more. Where can I find that research data?
For
what you just indicated.
Okay. It is in our Padlet and in the PowerPoint. So I don't have that, but I can certainly share that with you in just a second, if you give me a moment. I think we discussed that on day 1. So it's on that PowerPoint. I don't have that memorized. I'm sorry for that, but I can certainly look that up for you and share that with you in just a second.
But it does live in
when we get an opportunity.
Right. It does live in the slide deck that you prepared for workshop 1, correct?
Yes, it does. And I'm trying to find it here very quickly. But I may or may not get to it, and I certainly don't want to waste all of the other folks' time. Okay. But I'm trying to see if I can find it relatively quickly here.
Yeah, no worries. Just know that it's already exists in the Padlet in your workshop 1 slide deck.
Yes.
Just give yourself some time to go through the slide deck. I'm sure you will find it.
Yes. Other questions?
Could you please reshare the link to the path? Yes, sorry about that. I will take care of that. That question is
All
for
right.
us, not for you. Sorry.
Okay, I did find the slide. Actually, if you refer to slide workshop number 1, which is in the Padlet as well, you can click on the workshop 1 slide deck, and actually it is on slide number 80, and at the very bottom you'll see where that research comes from. And it's actually was done. I cited 2 different sources, one by Fletcher and the other one by the Carnegie Mellon University. They are the ones that recommend the ratio as well as the intensity of the supports. So that is, and you might also see that specific research in the PowerPoint for today. The reference sheet has the work of Fletcher as well, and the Carnegie University.
That's it for now, Karina.
Okay, perfect. All right, so we'll move on then. So let's talk about the instructional needs of ELs with dyslexia. And again, I'm sharing what the research says, right? So when using instruction based on the science of reading, okay, so there's the disclaimer there, right? When using instruction based on the science of reading, 95% of students can learn to read. Again, this is beneficial for all students. So as an instructor, as a teacher in the room in this call, what I want you to understand is that you're not designing lessons differently for your ELs with dyslexia. What I'm inviting you to do is to explore how you can design lessons that are based on the science of reading so that you can reach all of your students. Because this is beneficial for all students. And here's the breakdown of that for you. About 50% of students are able to learn with high quality tier 1 instruction. Half of the students will learn to read from explicit and direct instruction in foundational skills. There's a 5% here that struggle with severe cognitive impairments. That's a small subset of students that have severe cognitive disabilities and will likely struggle to read throughout their schooling. And on the first day when we were together, we talked about that, right? We talked how dyslexia presents in a continuum and how for some kiddos, it will continue to be a lifelong situation, that even in college and even in graduate school, we see those kiddos that are, or now adults, who are continuing to struggle, and things will come at a slower pace for them. And then 30% are capable of learning regardless of environment. These students will learn how to read regardless of instructional quality. Typically, what we know about this is that those kiddos are the ones that are coming from well-off homes where they have access to experiences, to higher language vocabulary exposure. They come from homes with high income, and they have abilities to be exposed to museums, to travel, to a variety of different things. The majority of the children that I have worked with do not come from that kind of background. 50% of our students require additional time and support. A minimal share of students will eventually enter tier 1 with additional attention and support. So they will need some other kind of support. You can look at this research. There is an executive summary to the EAB support, and it is found in the references page if you need to dig a little deeper on that. So what we know then is that we need to reweave. Remember, there's that the reading rope, right? And our purpose here as educators, as instructors, as evaluators, is to identify the holes that the children are bringing into their fabric and find that hole. And that's the piece of the evaluator, right? Where as a team, as an IEP team, we all have a role in that aspect of how we are going to identify if the child has dyslexia and then be more precise in identifying what type of dyslexia they have, and then identifying which area is the one that is giving them problems in the aspect of reading. Once we identify the whole, ideally, we then want to customize our instruction so that we can reweave that fabric. Okay. And remember that some students may have many holes. They may be lacking quite a few skills, but our role is to identify that and to begin to enter into the instruction in those points. So this other piece that I'm sharing with you is the learner profiles that are identified. This is the work of Dr. Mathers and Dr. Kilpatrick. They have identified dyslexic profiles. So you have your average reader. Okay, this is your typical child in a gen ed setting who has excellent or appropriate average word recognition, and they have average language comprehension. So they will more than likely be successful in any type of instruction. And then you have your dyslexic profile. That is a child who typically presents with word recognition that is low. The decoding piece, the phonology piece is missing, and language comprehension is typically high. This is the most traditional, if you will, cognitive profile of a dyslexic child. They do pretty well in language, oral kinds of abilities, but their word recognition is very poor. But then you have other kiddos who have word recognition that is high, but their language comprehension is low. And then you have the more complex child who presents with challenges in both areas. If you want to think about this from the perspective of which type of dyslexia, this may be the child with the third type, the mixed type of dyslexia, where there are language deficits as well, semantic and syntactical errors. So that, of course, will be the more complex child. So based on those learner profiles that we just identified, you can begin to customize instruction based on their unique needs. So for instance, I'm not, of course, touching the average reader, right? And that's not our focus for today. But the learner profile 2, which is the typical dyslexic profile, they present, and please know that these are generalizations, right? Each child would be so unique. These are general statements. So I want you to take this with a grain of salt, right? Just because I'm saying that this is the typical profile of a dyslexic student does not mean that your dyslexic student will present with this. So please keep that in mind. But relatively, or the majority of students will have relative strengths in the area of semantics, syntax, pragmatics, and discourse, especially at the listening level. Okay. So they do very well in this. They can express their thoughts, their ideas. They usually have a rich vocabulary. Areas of instructional need, however, for these kiddos will be the decoding piece, the phonology, teaching about orthography, and teaching about morphology. So some instructional strategies for you is to focus on the phonemic awareness, the reading and spelling patterns, practice reading words and sentences, providing them with decodable text, identifying where they are in the progress of prefixes, roots, suffixes, and combining forms, and then listening to increasingly complex text. You want to continue to provide them with that higher knowledge of language by providing them with maybe listening audio tapes, audio book tapes. Okay. So do they need all of these things? I don't know that. That is where your skill as a teacher comes in testing all of these components and identifying phonemic awareness. Got it. Reading and spelling patterns, that's shaky. That's what we're going to start with. So identifying all of these things is where you come in as an instructor, as a teacher. Now let's take a look at the learning profile 3. So this is the language based, right? So they have a relative strength in the phonology or in orthography, but they may have difficulties with the morphology, because now we're talking about higher language, right? Understanding morphemes, understanding prefixes and suffixes. That's higher thinking, requires a lot more language knowledge. Semantics might be a problem for them. Syntax, pragmatics, and different types of discourse may be a difficulty for them. So your instructional strategies will need to include the teaching explicitly of prefixes, roots, and suffixes in combining forms, developing academic vocabulary, being very intentional and systematic in your grammar and syntax, background knowledge in making inferences, text elements and structures, and graphic organizers. So those are all things that you will need to determine. Where are they in this, and where is my time going to be spent with this student? And as you could imagine, I think you can probably decipher this on your own. For children who have a profile that includes more complex, then you're looking at relative strengths, maybe pockets of skills, background knowledge. So they may have little components here and there, but in reality, most of the skills will need to be developed. So phonology, orthography, morphology, semantics, syntax, pragmatics, and discourse, all of that will need to be developed. And of course, your instruction strategies will include all of those components, and then adding maybe text elements and structures, adding graphic organizers, adding background knowledge to those pieces that I mentioned previously. So understanding the profile of your student is critical when you are designing lessons. That is why, as an evaluator, special education teachers, psychologists, and speech pathologists, our evaluations need to include this kind of information so that our teachers can then take that and say, okay, this is where we need to go, and determine what the starting point is for those children. So in terms of phonemic awareness, right? Remember that phonemic awareness, we talked on day 1 or 2, I can't recall now, but we said that phonemic awareness is a knowledge that is built upon others, right? So we start off by detecting rhymes, and then we start off by segmenting, so taking a word apart, such as the word cat, and separating k, at, okay? And then we can blend k, at. Now we can blend it and put it together and say cat. And then we manipulate sounds, eliminating first sounds, adding, eliminating the first or the last sound or the middle sound, and then bringing in other things, and even reversing, right? So David Kilpatrick has a lot of research on this, and this continues to be the building block of reading, regardless of your age. So please do not think of this as an elementary task, as a kindergarten, first grade task. It's something that all readers need, and your high schoolers are probably lacking this if they're not reading. But your role as an educator is to find what is your entry point. Where are they in this sequential steps of phonemic awareness? Okay, so that's where your testing comes in. And then for the graphophonemic knowledge, right? Grapho means the visual letter, and the phonemic is the sound, right? Grapho, visual, phonemic, auditory. So again, your role as an educator is to determine what is your entry point in this. We start off with the sequence of letter sound introduction, understanding that the letter M says and now I'm attaching a visual representation of that. And then we move to consonants, and then we move to vowels, and then we move to consonant digraphs and trigraphs. Those are 3 letters that are combined, right? Vowel digraphs and trigraphs, and then diphthongs and combinations, so other combination letters. This is the order in which we present these concepts. So entry point for you, what is it? Okay, and that is something that you will need to determine. Morphological knowledge, we start off with root words, and then we add prefixes and suffixes and bound roots. And I'm giving you an example of those bound roots. So you can see, for instance, jet, right? Like reject or inject, right? So once you teach that, you're really opening up the door for a multitude of other words that have similar patterns. Okay, so that's how we build upon that. And this is such a critical skill for our upper grade students to have. Our high schoolers could benefit so tremendously from this, because this can open the door for them in terms of social science and science as well. So what's next? Where do we go? Where do we begin? Where do we go from here? These are some suggestions for you. And I will take the rest of the time that we have together to go over some of the resources that I'm sharing with you so that you know what's there. I know that if I just tell you, you probably won't know, and you will not know that they exist. So what we need to do next is recognize the components of reading instruction, which I provided you a very rudimentary kind of instruction on that, right? And then you want to consider what is in place already. What do I have in my instruction, and what is missing in my instruction? What could I add? Remember that we take little bites to finish off and to eat off an elephant, right? It is not realistic for you to think that you're going to have all of this together maybe this academic year. But what can you incorporate? And it doesn't matter if you're in the classroom. It doesn't matter if you're a psychologist or a speech therapist. What have you heard in the last 3 times that we have been together? What have you heard that you're not doing yet that you want to incorporate into your practice? You start with something small. That's how we build a house. You build something one layer at a time. Okay. Data should drive your instruction. So based on that, you will begin to select materials and begin to select other options that you need in order to do this work. So for a school psychologist, that may be, I'm not incorporating phonemic awareness components into my assessment. So I need to have good tools that measure not only visual processing kinds of things, but I also need to incorporate orthographic kinds of things into my assessment. Where do I go to gather that? What do I need? What's available to me already in my school or in my district? And how do I make my practice better? And if you're in the classroom, what of these components of reading are you not including yet? And where can you start? And the data will drive that. So you begin instruction of reading components based on the student need. And I think what I would like to do at this point is to invite you to take a look with me to the in the Drive folder that I'm sharing, so we can see some of the tools that I'm sharing for that purpose. So let me do that right now. Give me 1 second while I pull that up. And let's see. So you have access to this folder. I know that my friends dropped that in the chat. Let me then share those tools that are available for you. And that way we can take a quick look at them and see what is available, so that you'll know where to go get it if you ever need to grab that. So I'm hoping that you're able to see my screen where I have the folder up and running. The folder is labeled Imperial County SELPA handouts, right? So a couple of things, and not in any particular order, but I do want to bring up, I think, this first one here. As an educator, as a teacher, this concept of structuring reading instruction may not have been something that you were taught, and that's okay. Recognizing what your starting point is equally as important. So I'm sharing some of the resources that I have come, to my hands. And education is all about that, right? We borrow, we beg, and we steal from others. And I stole this from Letters. Letters is um, not a program.
It's a framework.
It's a framework, and not even a framework. They're more of a company, if you will, that has come together to teach teachers how to teach reading. And they have developed their own scope and sequence. Are there other scopes and sequences? Yes, there are. But I find that this one is very similar to the other ones that I looked at. This scope and sequence that you're looking at right now is based on the science of reading, and it has been mirrored to match the Orton-Gillingham approach to reading. Remember, Orton-Gillingham is not a program. You cannot go and buy that. It is an approach, meaning that you learn how to teach that based on a particular scope and sequence. So if you take a look at this can be a good starting point for you if you have no idea yet where to start. So your reading assessments will tell you if the child is at any particular one of these levels. Notice that the grade level that is attached only means that we're teaching typically at that level those skills. But the reality is that many of our middle school and high school kiddos may not understand digraphs. They may not understand long vowels. They may come to a diphthong and not know what to do with that. So that is your entry point. So forget about the grade level. That is your entry point where you are going to be filling in those holes that are in that fabric. Okay. So this is an idea of the scope and sequence, and you can see examples of that. And it moves on, and it integrates, compounds, inflectional suffixes, common prefixes, and variational suffixes and long roots. By the time you are here, you are pretty fluent in your reading, and you can tackle most words. And what we're actually doing is providing children with access. If we can get them to read to this level, I'm not saying that our work is done, but what I'm saying is that we have allowed them the ability to break the code on their own, and they can continue to expand their reading on their own. Most of the work that is out there in terms of reading in the public sector, in the public setting, most of that work is written at about a 3rd to 5th grade level. So if we can provide access to at least this level, we have provided kiddos the opportunity to access and have a civil, access to many things. I'm not saying that we should stop there. Please hear me out. That's not what I'm saying. At this level, you still will have a difficult time with AP courses or A through C courses. I understand that, but it is a way of allowing students to be able to crack the code on their own. Okay, so that's one of the things that I wanted to point out of the handouts that are here. And let me see if I can go back. That's not, hold on. I closed that. Okay. Other things that I want to share is this concept of phonemic awareness. There's a visual here. Phonemic awareness is a tower. Think of it as a tower that you will start off. This can give you an idea where to start with this process of teaching phonemic awareness. And then for the assessment of phonemic awareness, I want to share this screener. This was developed by Dr. Kilpatrick. You have heard me mention him quite a few times. His work is well respected. He has developed a test that is called the PAST, the Phonological Awareness Screening Test. The instructions on how to do it are here, and how to score it are here. And then he gives you an interpreting scale. And then here's the test. This is free to be used. You can Google his name, Google the test. He has made this available for free. So that's the other thing that I respect. He understands the importance of it. So he has made it available for educators. So this will give you a pretty good idea of where that child is in the area of phonemic awareness. Are they starting with rhymes, or are we all the way at the very high level phonemic awareness skills? And that will give you a starting point of where you need to design your instruction. Remember, and I know I've said it many times already, so please forgive me, but phonemic awareness is the #1 skill that is holding our high schoolers back. In terms of phonological awareness, I've shared with you a couple of resources that you can tap into. And I think I want to share probably maybe this one. Here's a morphological instructional sequence for grades 4 and up. Remember, if you have a middle school student or a high school student that doesn't have this, don't let the grade fool you. This is your entry point, and this is where you're going to start off with. There's a couple of readings that you can do here. They also give you a sequence, a scope and sequence of how to teach and where to teach and what to teach first, because these are skills that build upon each other. Don't let the grades fool you. If you have the advantage of starting fresh, in first grade, good for you. Now you know that these are the things that you should be covering. But if you are in middle or in high school, these are the areas that you need to know. Okay, my 7th grader should know this already, but they don't. So I need to go back then and build the house from the ground up. Okay. And here are some examples of what those specific prefixes could look like. So for instance, the word sub for subgroup, for submarine, for succession, success, you get the point. And it goes on to include other appendices for other affixes. The word affixes is a word that is used to combine prefixes and suffixes together and root words. So you see Latin roots here, you see some Greek roots. And there's also a linguistic glossary. For those of us that did not have the privilege of having this instruction as part of our preparation programs, this can also allow you to become far more fluent in this topic of reading, okay? Recommended reading resources are here as well, and then a few other lesson structures. So I love this because it gives you an idea of how do I structure a mini lesson. Please know that these lessons, most interventions should not be more than 20 to 30 minutes. So it is doable. It's a matter of designing, your day to allow for this kind of intervention to take place. Other things that I wanted to highlight for you, there's a couple of lists of Greek, Latin derivatives, prefixes, and suffixes, like a started list. So you can, if you're not sure where to go, where to find them, here's some of that where you can begin. And it gives you the meaning and the example of a few. Let's see, what else? Here's some phoneme and spelling rules. So for instance, consonant and continuous sounds and spellings that are voiceless. It just gives you some ideas of how to pronounce those words. Oftentimes when we're teaching to read, as educators, if we haven't gone through training, if we haven't been told, we make the mistake of adding a schwa at the end of a vowel sound, such as, for instance, the letter D. Sometimes when we're teaching students to read, we make the mistake of saying duh. The word D does not say duh. The letter D does not say duh. It says duh. It needs to be very clean, very clear, and not add the sound at the end, because in reality, you're adding a letter A or U at the end. So that's what this is all about, to kind of teach yourself how to produce those sounds so that when you are teaching that to students, you're doing that very cleanly. And then I would encourage you to look to your speech pathologist to assist you with that as well. I mean, that's what we're there for, to assist all of us in this process and to tap into the knowledge that we all bring. The other resources that I'm sharing with you have to do with vocabulary development. And I have a couple of lists here for tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 vocabulary words, and how we need to be very selective on that. Now, remember that these are lists that are random. Ideally, you want to be able to select words that are attached to the core content that you're teaching, right? So take a look at those. They're resources. And see how that fits into everything else that you are doing, that you're already incorporating, and how you can continue to enrich what you are doing and make little gains, right, in your production. Here's What Works Clearinghouse. I mentioned that earlier. Providing reading interventions for students in grades 4 through 9. This is a practice guide summary. It's a very quick read. I invite you to take a look at that. And then furthermore, what I would invite you to do, and I know Lupita dropped that in the link in the chat for us, What Works Clearinghouse. If you have now identified that in your tools, you're missing components related to phonemic awareness, okay, then maybe I'm now ready to go and purchase something. What is that something that I'm going to request? It shouldn't be any random thing. Ideally, you want to come to this What Works Clearinghouse and actually see the research that has been conducted and find out, is it peer review? What are the results that have been obtained from that? So those are some of the ideas that I also wanted to share with you. So I think that's all that I wanted to highlight. I will leave this open for eternity. I have no intention of bringing this down. You're welcome to download whatever you need, equally from the Padlet as well. If there's anything in the Padlet that you think is a benefit to you, you're welcome to take that. You're welcome to take whatever I've shared with you. So with that, I think that's all I have, and we are at about 11:40 or so. So that gives us some nice time to wrap up our 3 days together and talk about where we go from here and what's next and what questions you may have. And as we engage in that conversation, what I would like for you to consider are these questions that I have here for us. What has resonated with you? Whether you attended today or you were fortunate enough and your schedule allowed for all 3 workshops, what has resonated with you? What are you taking away? What could be one short-term goal that you can quickly begin to integrate? And what is one long-term goal for you? I truly believe that there's power in journaling, that there's power in writing what we are thinking and envisioning. So I would ask that you grab a piece of paper. Hopefully you have some of that handy for you in front of you. And that if you can just take a few minutes, I'm going to be quiet for a few minutes and allow you to respond to these questions on your own. And then maybe after that, we can open it up, Lupita, and I don't know if does the recording stop at that point? Okay. Sure.
We can stop it at this point if we're all done
Okay.
with the formal presentation.
Yes.